Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to Society and the State, episode 104. We're talking to Brian Doherty, who is the senior editor of Reason magazine, about gun control, 3D printing, and all of this craziness that's happening. Brian, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Connor.
So I want to start maybe at the beginning. So a lot of people have maybe seen all the fury in the news, but let's walk this back a little bit, maybe by starting to talk about the company and the man behind it. So can you tell us at least a little bit about Defense Distributed, Cody Wilson? What did they start doing that caused all the fury?
Yeah, you know, the very fact that this is a story that I've been writing about for Reason for 6 years now is actually the reason why all the media panic this week is misguided. Because what happened back in 2013, this is a guy named Cody Wilson who is thinks of himself as an anarchist. He has a polemical purpose of basically wanting to prove to people that state and government power is so easily circumvented in the modern world that it becomes essentially meaningless. So he's into things like Bitcoin, which is a way to theoretically, technically get around the need to have a government to make money, and he's into 3D printing, which are ways to technically get around any restriction on any physical object that people might be barred from, owning or making. And he was the very first person back in 2013 to use a 3D printer, which, if people, most people have never used one to this day. It's a device that can take computerized instructions and basically deposit layers of plastic polymer to create physical objects made of plastic. And he created a gun, essentially, that was entirely plastic except for the firing pin, which was made of metal. And in 2013, he became, as far as we know, the first human being to fire a weapon made out of a 3D printer. Now, these things are not sturdy. They're generally one use, maybe two uses at most. They break. They're not. They were kind of. He did it basically to prove the concept, and he thought this proved that, hey, government gun control is meaningless if anyone with a device that they can buy for $1,000 or so can make a gun at home, your attempts to legally restrict it are meaningless. And then what happened after, and he's a real publicity hound, like he definitely, he was doing this to prove a point. He didn't want to do it in secret. He had media with him at the moment that he fired this first gun, and that media attention also brought government attention. And also all the way back in 2013, he got a letter from the State Department of the United States saying, hey, what you're doing here is you're distributing instructions about how to make a weapon, and you're distributing them on the internet, which means you're exporting them essentially. And the United States has laws about the exporting of munitions, and the government told him, hey, we think that what you're doing here might run afoul of our regulations about exporting munitions, and we suggest that you stop doing it. For all his anarchism, Cody Wilson does not want to go to jail, and generally when he's explicitly ordered by the government to do something, he tries to do it. So he stopped distributing the files. But this is the thing about the internet, and this is also part of the whole point he wanted to prove. Once those files are out there, it doesn't matter at all that he and his company, Defense Distributed, are legally barred from distributing the files. The files are everywhere anyway. That's one of the things about the internet. It makes government attempts to restrict information pretty much impossible. And when Cody got this threat from the government, he sued them. He said, look, as far as I'm concerned, instructions that tell a device, and originally it was these 3D plastic printers, but he later started selling a thing he calls the Ghost Gunner, which is what's called a CNC mill, which is a device that actually can mill metal objects as well. It doesn't print them, but it cuts them and mills them, right? So he's now dealing with both the printing of plastic guns and the homemade gunsmithing of metal guns. And in his opinion, he's like, this is instructions. It's no different than a printed instruction manual for home gunsmithing. And home gunsmithing is, by the way, legal. It always has been. There is no law in the United States that says you cannot make for your own personal use a gun at home. Once you start entering it into the stream of commerce, it gets, much more restricted and complicated. But making one for yourself is legal. It's always been legal. And his stance was, look, this is just instructions of how to make a gun. It's protected by the First Amendment. And this lawsuit had been going on and on for 5 years. And what happened last month is, after lots of twists and turns that we don't need to get into, the government decided, we don't actually want to litigate this to the end. And you know what? We're just gonna settle. We're gonna say, okay, we're not going to consider these computerized files munitions that you're exporting. And the settlement, which came down late last month in July, basically said it's okay. These computerized files, you can distribute them. And to remind, again, they've been out there in the world all the time anyway. It's like the only person in the world who is legally restricted from distributing them was this guy and his company. So it all seemed pointless, and I think that's probably what was driving the government's thinking. And maybe, there's no way of knowing this, because part of the reason why they settle instead of litigating it to the end is maybe they didn't want an official judicial opinion that said, yeah, you're violating the First Amendment here. And I'll point out that the government did not admit that they were violating any rights by restricting the files. They just said, okay, yeah, go ahead. It's fine. And then what happened last week is this upset a bunch of state governments, attorney generals of various states of a more liberal bent, kind of anti-gun bent, were horrified with the thought that, now suddenly, they seem to believe, citizens in our states are going to be able to make guns at home, and this is going to be dangerous for us. And again, this ability has been out there since 2013. I do not know of any case in which anyone has used a plastic, 3D printed gun to harm anyone. And I'll also point out but it's been around for 5 years. Like the notion that they sort of were acting like, oh my gosh, the government agreed to let this happen, so suddenly it's going to happen, where in reality it's been happening as much as anyone could ever have wanted it to happen since 2013. So the argument that the existence of this technology is a clear and present grave danger to the citizens of their states that the government needs to stop doesn't hold up very well. But what they did a few days ago, earlier in the week, in early August, get a federal judge in the state of Washington to place a temporary restraining order technically on both the government and on this guy Cody Wilson and his company, saying, hey, the settlement that you guys tried to come to, we're putting that aside for now. Legally, you both must behave as if you did not come to the settlement. And Cody Wilson, again, who does not want to go to jail, instantly complied. Him and his company are no longer distributing these files. But again, anyone and everyone else can and is. Like, if you did want to do this, if you wanted to get your metal CNC mill to make a metal gun at home, or get your 3D printer to make a plastic gun at home, it's all out there. You could do it if you want. So that's where we're at with this. And I think the news panic, the main thing that people are panicking about this get it wrong is acting as if a new situation has arisen in the world because of this settlement. Like, no one could do this before the settlement, and now suddenly they can, which is just not true. And as a political matter, a lot of the attorney generals and a lot of the media out there seem to see this as a Trump administration thing. They sort of have this vision that, Trump's a nutty right-winger, right? And that means he's a super radical for Second Amendment rights. And so the only reason that the government settled this case is because Trump wants everyone to have a gun. And not true at all. The reason the government did this is based in a lot of legal and procedural technicalities that we don't need to get into. And the biggest proof that it did not arise from any kind of attitude about guns of Donald Trump is when the media brouhaha hit, President Trump himself tweeted, I don't have the wording exactly, but basically in that Trump style, like, what's all this about making plastic guns at home? Seems, doesn't seem right to me. And then at a press conference later, Sarah Huckabee Sanders reiterated that the President Trump does not approve of the idea of people making their own plastic guns at home. To circle around again, it has always been illegal, or not always, but since 1988, it has been illegal to make a gun that cannot be detected by a metal detector. So if you are making a gun that's entirely plastic, and that first one that Cody Wilson made, again, was not entirely plastic. It had a metal firing pin. If you are doing that, that is against the law. However, to get back to the constitutional issue, Wilson is arguing, look, it might be against the law to make a plastic gun, but given that we have a First Amendment and freedom of speech, it should not be against the law to issue instructions about how to do it. Like, he's trying to raise a distinction between actually violating the law and words or, computer files that can instruct people or a device to do something that, if they did it, would break the law.
Now, Brian,
it's somewhat. Yes.
Let me just interject on that point, because I'm familiar with, under existing precedent, people can upload and share materials for example, bomb making, right? You can go get the Anarchist Cookbook. You can find literature online. You can find information that people who are known and identifiable are able to produce and say, well, here's how you could do X, even though doing X is illegal. And so, isn't the point here that and I assume that Cody and his legal team are making that point, that there's a free speech precedent for discussing how you might do an action, even if that action is illegal and the discussion thereof is not illegal. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. And again, I'm sure understanding that is probably part of why the government didn't want to litigate it to the end. But the funny thing about the temporary restraining order that the judge in Washington put out is he completely ignores the First Amendment arguments. He acts like they weren't even made. The restraining order is basically made on an incredibly arcane procedural issue, the question of whether, hey, when the government decided to say we're not going to treat these computer files as munitions that it is illegal to export, when the government made that decision, according to the judge, they violated their own procedural rules. And Wilson's legal team believes, and they make a case I think is pretty good, that what actually technically happened did indeed follow administrative procedure, and that's an issue that, the whole thing about temporary restraining orders is it's telling people in a legal dispute, hey, we haven't actually settled this yet, but until we do, I'm just going to tell one side to cool down about the thing that they're doing, and that's what's happened. It does not mean that the judge has declared, yeah, absolutely, the government can stop you from distributing these files. It's saying, hey, until we've completely settled this case, just stop doing it for a while. And again, they have stopped doing it.
If, as you point out, the cat's out of the bag, these files are out there. In fact, I've seen Facebook friends in the past few days sharing, Google Drive links online where you can download them and just helping seed them around the internet. So if the cat's out of the bag, why do you suppose Cody is pursuing this legal matter when it only pertains to him and prosecutors would be unable to get the entire internet to take these files down?
Yeah, well, he's doing it because he does believe in the First Amendment argument that he's making, and he's obeying because he doesn't want to go to jail. And he, as I said, he's a real kind of media prankster, and I think, though I don't know if he would say this in so many words, that he's trying to prove the point that in this age of computers and the internet, that the government is powerless to stop this. He might be willing to be, sort of the martyr who's like, okay, I can't do this. Okay, the government says if I do this, I'm in trouble, but that's completely meaningless. The government really didn't win anything because the thing that they want to not happen, they can't stop it from happening. It's like, okay, you can tell me I can't do it. Okay, I'm not doing it, but so what? And that's kind of part of the whole point he's making, is that we live in a technological age where certain government restrictions are just impossible. Like at a certain stage of the case, I think it was the point where he got the settlement, he tweeted out an image with like a tombstone saying, gun control, rest in peace. His idea is that, look, gun control just can't happen in this world, and it doesn't matter if I'm restricted from doing it. But of course, he doesn't want to be restricted from doing it, and he's continued to fight because he would like, it's a business he's running called Defense Distributed. He'd like to be able to stay in the business, but all along, kind of the underlying point of everything he's been doing is, you can pretend to think that you've stopped me, but you haven't actually stopped the thing you're trying to stop, and you never can.
Now, it seems to me, like take Bitcoin, for example. You mentioned he's a supporter, and many people have this kind of underlying concern that, look, at the end of the day, central governments are not going to take this lying down. If this ever gets to the point where it gets sufficient adoption to pose a threat to, this fiat currency regime and the government's money-making power, there's going to be a reaction. Do you foresee ever the same thing happening here, where notwithstanding him making the point that, look, it's out there, is the government going to take this lying down? Are the gun control activists going to just relent? Or what do you forecast in the years ahead that this kind of 3D printing individual freedom, gun control issue looks like?
There probably will be issues around the margins where things like this happen, where there's a specific case and a specific person who's doing a specific thing, and the government is going to try to punish that person or stop that person. But the activity, whether it be the use and spread of Bitcoin or the use and spread of any kind of computerized file, the use and spread of things like, the Silk Road, which the government shut down, which was a site on the dark web where people could use Bitcoin to buy illegal things. You can punish a person, you can enjoin a company, but you can never, never, never actually stop the vast majority of people who want to be able to use these technologies from using them. So, government is probably never going to stop making life a little bit hard for certain people on the margins of this, of whatever of these technological law-breaking activities we're discussing, but they never will be able to actually stop the activity from happening. And I predict that in the specific case of Cody Wilson fighting over the legality of distributing these computer files, that he will end up winning. That, like, if ever a court has to actually decide on the merits, that they will recognize that, this actually is information that you're spreading. It's not inherently violating the law. It's merely information that could theoretically help someone violate the law, and you can't stop that in a country with the First Amendment.
I should point out for our listeners that you've written an article that comprehensively goes over these points, provides a number of links for those wanting to learn more. We'll link to that at the show notes page for today, which is societyandthestate.com/104. Another question for you, Brian, briefly is, I feel that more of this will be happening. You mentioned, for example, Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht, who had done that. We've got Cody Wilson here. We've got Julian Assange with WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. Do you foresee in the future we'll see more of these, crypto anarchist, liberty-minded activists using technology to undercut core government regulations? It seems to me that with these kind of prominent few that we've had, that it's only the beginning. What are your thoughts on the kind of broader issue there?
Yeah, no doubt. And if I were a good enough futurist, to actually pinpoint, and here's the next thing to fall, I wouldn't just be a journalist. Another one I'll mention, and it might not come to people's minds because it hasn't been quite as outlaw as, Edward Snowden, who's in exile in Russia, Julian Assange, who's locked in an embassy, and, Cody Wilson, who's been in legal fights for 5 years, and Ross Ulbricht, who's in prison for life. But another character who is doing similar things and with a similar libertarian bent is Travis Kalanick, who founded Uber, right? I mean, that was a similar thing. He's like, okay, we've developed a technology that allows people to find hired rides in a field that currently is highly regulated, and they started basically by just doing it and saying, okay, stop us, tell us we're breaking the law, and join us, and they basically, I'm doing a very broad overview of basically the story of Uber and Lyft over the last 5 years, but more or less how they went politically is they put it out there. They got enough of a citizen fan base to the point where, city councils or mayors or states realized, hey, we're really actually going to piss off lots of people if we completely make this impossible. And so far, they pretty much won. And, that's another example of that. And yeah, anything that people want and that you can facilitate with whatever technology is at hand is absolutely going to happen. And government may be able to punish certain people who stick their heads up too much. They may be able to get someone and put them in jail, but, for people who don't follow things like Silk Road, it's like, okay, wow, that site got shut down. The guy who started it will be rotting in prison for the rest of his life. Does that mean that the government won? Does that mean that people are no longer using Bitcoin to buy illegal things over the Internet? No, of course not. People are using Bitcoin to buy illegal things over the Internet at a far higher rate than they were when Ross Ulbricht was running the Silk Road. So, yeah, these fights cannot be won. Certain people can be punished. Laws can be passed. But if the government's goal is to stop the things from happening, that will never happen.
Just a little footnote on your mention of Uber and Lyft. I know this was the case for Lyft. I believe it was for Uber that they were very intentional about cultivating that fan base to proceed with the strategy you mentioned, to the point where they were telling drivers that they would pay for any fines that they received as a way to hold them harmless and encourage them to continue. Because, of course, the fear of having, for example, here in Salt Lake City, we featured a story that finally led to kind of the political reform that legalized these companies, but initially it was illegal. We featured the story of a single mom who was fined, I believe it was $6,500 when an undercover officer, kind of a secret shopper, identified that she was driving with Lyft. And so they were cracking the whip like crazy at the city level, finding these people with this secret shopper type of enforcement. And routinely the cities would just pay for it to make sure that those individuals were not punished, encouraging them to continue driving, which then brought more of a fan base. Brilliant strategy. And I'm glad that you pointed out, because it's not always like these shady things. It's not always criminal implications or national secrets or scary guns or anything like that. I think the Uber and Lyft example is great, where so often I think those of us who work in the political realm get narrowly focused in thinking that, all these horrible laws, we need to build, consensus and we need to get the laws changed. But then you look at these dynamic entrepreneurs or even just activists or even anarchists who are going out there and doing things that can have far broader reforms, in the sense of maybe not changing the law, but changing the culture enough where the law becomes unenforced or perhaps irrelevant.
Exactly. And when it's about things that actually are either a positive good for most people, which is the ability to get hired rides, faster and easier, and the ability to work as a driver faster and easier, or things that maybe you might personally not think is that great a thing, like more people having weapons, but it's not a thing that inherently harms anyone. It does help reminding people that 99.9% of weapon owners in this country will never use their weapon to harm someone else in an illegitimate way. A gun in someone's hands does not equal a harm or a crime. Same thing with some of these sales of illegal items. You might not approve of their use. You might think their use is terrible for you personally or for other people personally, but the idea is, most people, if people want to do it, and if people do not feel that they're harming others or themselves, and they have the technology to do it, it's going to happen. And that's kind of been the lesson of technology in the 21st century, whether it be Uber or 3D printing or, Bitcoin. And people like Wilson, Snowden, Assange as well, even Ross Ulbricht, though he obviously tried to be secret about it, they are doing it with an ideology behind them, and it is a kind of libertarianish pro-freedom ideology, what some might consider a classically American ideology, that, look, we're about liberty, and the restrictions of the law should be only specifically about doing direct harm to other people, and, government shouldn't have the power to manage and regulate every aspect of our lives, as long as what we're doing is voluntarily serving other people's needs. And that is the world we live in. And then the government, I don't think, is going to be able to stop it, though, again, they always will be able to make life hard on certain people trying to do these things, like they have done to Mr. Wilson for the past 5 years.
Fascinating stuff. Your article has a number of quotes from this legal battle and other sources. I'd encourage our listeners to go check it out. It will be linked at societyandthestate.com/104. Brian Doherty, Senior Editor, Reason Magazine, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Connor. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.